Hi Yogi, it's Bri. In this video, we're going to look at a few different hip openers, such as pigeon prep, Sukhasana and Agni Stambhasana, and even reclined pigeon, and ways that you can verbally cue your students to actually feel the stretch more, as well as some really nice physical adjustments. The first hip opener that we're going to look at is reclined pigeon. And reclined pigeon is definitely one of those more accessible hip openers, especially if you have students who are too tight to sit up in your seated Sukhasana or Agni Stambhasana and maybe knee injuries so they can't do pigeon prep. She's going to cross her right ankle over her left knee and thread the right arm through the keyhole, taking her left arm around the outside of the leg. So typically grabbing the hamstring, like you did initially, is the more accessible place to be. Personally, if you wanted to feel more, you would grab the shin. And I would say that. I would say grab the hamstring. And if you want to deepen the stretch, then you can grab the shin for a little more of a compact pull. Now, I don't even need to come over and do anything physically if I'm teaching this verbally right. So her bent leg, her right leg, I'm going to say flex the foot. And because we're always looking for counter actions, or in physiotherapy they call it distractions, I want her right leg, the leg that's being stretched, to do the opposite first of what we're looking to do, right? So if she pushes her right knee away from her, that creates space in the outer right hip and actually in the femur, between the femur and the hip socket. Then she keeps that action of pushing the right knee forward, flexing the right foot, and matches it by pulling everything else in towards her. Yeah, that's where you're really going to start to feel a deep stretch and a safe stretch. I can help her deepen it a little bit. Take your hand behind the hamstring instead. For this adjustment, the hands have to be interlaced behind the hamstring. I take her lifted leg foot onto my hip flexor area or onto my quad, just depending on how tall you are. I'm pretty short, so that works. And then I begin to lean down. I take my other hand, the opposite hand, the same hand as the bent leg, and I root that bent leg hip or sit bone down. And then I use the foot that's on my knee or my hip flexor to push forward. She's dying. All right, I can even put my hand on her knee, and it's matching the same amount of pressure. So I'm rooting as much as I'm pushing. I could even take my hand into the hip crease and pull forward as I push down. And that's a little bit less pressure and creating a little bit more space, but rooting down will give her the stretch that she needs. All right, so that is reclined pigeon. She's going to sit up, face the camera, and we'll do Sukhasana and Agni Stambhasana. So Sukhasana is your traditional crisscross applesauce, right? But most people cross their legs too far underneath them. So what we want to do is try to create more of a box shape so that your shins are in a straight line even though they're crossed, and that your heels are underneath each knee with the feet flexed. The flexing of the foot really helps to elongate the lower part of the leg and engage the upper part of the leg. We want to engage the upper part of the leg because we want the hips to draw back. So from here, she pushes the knees down and she hugs the glutes in towards one another. Because we're in external rotation, we want to facilitate and stabilize external rotation, and that's what the glutes do. So as she pushes the knees down and hugs the glutes in, she can lengthen the spine as she inhales and exhales, fold down. So basically, if I understand what I want her to do in the pose, that there is external rotation going on, there's a rooting action in the pelvis, then a lengthening through the spine, then I know that my adjustment wants to complement that. Anytime I give adjustments, there's always rooting and lengthening. So here, I would use my hands on the hip creases to really roll the thigh bones out. This is much like my Baddha Konasana or Upavishta Konasana adjustment, externally rotating the thigh bones, but also pulling back and down to root the hips down. And then my knees go into that really rounded spot in the low back just to gently place pressure forward. And if I wanted to put more pressure down into the rooting action, I would lift my butt up so that my hands have more of that rooting down action to lengthen forward. And go ahead and rise up. And the same thing goes for Agni Stambhasana, or double pigeon. The only thing that, tends to happen here is that people like me who have hypermobility in their joints, specifically the ankle or the knee, tend to be in that position, right? In that hyperflexed or hyperextended position. So I would adjust by saying flex your feet. Try to get the top leg foot, probably do the other side because we already did this side for you, just for balance. Try to get the top leg foot to just hang off the bottom leg knee just a little bit, because then again, just like Sukhasana, you're creating that boxed shape. Now from here, if your students have like intensely tight hips and they're here in this position, it might not be beneficial to do Agni Stambhasana. They might come back to Sukhasana, or you can help them by taking one hand, rooting the bottom leg hip down, taking the other hand onto the top leg knee and asking them to push up into that hand, push up. Good. This is P and F, right? A little bit of P and F as they push up, then they inhale for about 5 seconds and then exhale, release. And now I can just gently push down and get a little bit more space for them. And it might be a lot less space than she had just then, but that's a really nice way to help people with really tight hips. From here, she folds down just to her best ability. For a lot of people in Agni Stambhasana, folding down doesn't feel as good as sitting up. So make sure that you know that. I always give that option when I teach this. Hey, if sitting up feels better, you could sit up and push that top leg knee down, just creating space in the hip flexors. If what they choose to do is fold down, then they'll feel more of a stretch in the outer hips. I can do the same exact adjustment. Root the outer hips as I externally rotate the thigh bones and lengthen the spine forward. Okay? All right, last hip stretch, pigeon prep. She's going to come into pigeon prep. And this is also about cueing. So I typically cue it from here. I say, bring that right shin forward, the left leg back behind you. First, look back at your straight leg. Make sure it's in a straight line from the sit bone to the heel. And there's a slight bit of internal rotation. So the inner thigh reaches up towards the ceiling. That internal rotation will neutralize the pelvis. Then, of course, if that front leg hip is lifted up off the ground, placing anything underneath it, I prefer a blanket or a towel. A block is just really uncomfortable and not very stable, but that works too. The front leg foot is always a point, is always a question. Should I be flexing it? Should I be pointing it? And really, it's just about the depth of the pose. If your hips are pretty open and you really need to feel extra sensation, then the more parallel your front leg shin is and the more flexed the foot is, the deeper you're going to feel the stretch. That said, not everybody can do that. Okay, so there's also a misconception that it's better for the knee. Yes, a flex of the foot is better for the knee, but that angle, that 90-degree angle in external rotation is quite taxing on the knee if you're tight. So if you're tight, which is 90% of the people out there in yoga rooms, you're going to have a bit of an angle, right? And your foot is not going to be flexed. In fact, it should be pointed. And you should be pushing the shin down firmly into the mat. Either one, you should be pushing the shin down, because pushing the shin down contracts the muscles in the leg to protect the knee. She folds down. Okay, so I can verbally cue an adjustment for her. If she's got the proprioception in her body and she's listening, her creating the stability and length in her own body will be the most effective, even more effective than an adjustment, because I'm not in her body. I don't know how much pressure she wants or how little pressure she wants. So when I cue this, I ask students to come up onto the forearms. Okay. From here, you want to think about pushing that front leg shin down, drawing your outer front leg hip back and down, and then internally rotating the back leg thigh. Then from there, continuing to root the pelvis in one place, inhale, lengthen the spine, crawl the arms slightly forward as you draw the ribs and the navel in, and exhale, fold all the way down. So she's giving herself this stabilization and this lengthening, which in turn gives her an adjustment. If I want it, since I know what she should be doing, then I also know what my adjustment should be doing at the same time. I'm using one hand to externally rotate and stabilize the front leg hip back and down. I'm using the other hand to neutralize the other hip, whether it be on the upper glute and pressing down to help internally rotate the thigh, or I could also lengthen the opposite side of the spine forward. So both are really effective in helping them feel the stretch more. Last one would be scooping the outer hips in and just gently placing pressure down on the upper glutes equally. And that's pigeon prep, one of my favorites.